The transport shuttle shuddered as it docked with Station Korath 7, and the new cadets inside grabbed whatever they could to stay on their feet. Sergeant Kale Virath stood at the far end orientation hall with his arms folded across his scaled chest, and watched the doors slide open with a low hiss that echoed through the massive chamber, like the breath of something ancient and hungry. He had done this for 15 years now, standing in this exact spot, watching fresh meat stumble through those doors with wide eyes and trembling limbs. And every single year, he could tell within the first 30 seconds which ones would survive the academy and which ones would wash out before the snow fell on the northern peaks of Korath. The Krethok cadets came through first, because they always did, shouldering past the others without apology. 400 pounds of dark fur and corded muscle, moving with the easy confidence of creatures who had never once, in their evolutionary history, needed to wonder whether they were at the top of the food chain. Behind them came the Vithani, tall and insectoid, their compound eyes scanning every surface and cataloging every exit, because that was what Vithani did before they even said hello. Then the Peleki, amphibious and broad, their wet skin glistening under the station lights. Then a handful of other species Kale had trained before, each one slotting neatly into the mental categories he had built over a decade and a half of shaping cadets into soldiers. And then, at the very back of the line, a human walked in. Kale leaned forward just slightly. She was small by any galactic standard, compact and lean with close-cropped dark hair and brown skin, and a duffel bag slung over one shoulder that looked like it had been through 3 wars already. Her name, according to the file, was Cadet Lena Vasquez, and she was one of only 3 humans ever admitted to the Galactic Union Joint Military Academy. Kale had read her file twice the night before, and still was not sure what to make of it. Humans were new to the galactic stage, barely 2 generations into their membership in the Union, and the scientific community still could not agree on what to classify them as. They had forward-facing eyes like predators, but lacked claws or fangs, or venom or armor plating, or any of the standard equipment that predator-class species carried as a birthright. Their homeworld was classified as a Category 12 death world, which should have produced something terrifying, and yet what it had produced was this: a 5'6" woman with an easy smile who looked like a stiff wind would knock her into the next system. Kale watched her walk across the hall and noticed 2 things immediately. First, she did not look around the way prey species did, scanning for threats with nervous energy. Second, she did not swagger the way predator species did, announcing their presence with confidence. Dominance with every step. She just walked, calm and unhurried, like she had walked into 1,000 rooms full of creatures bigger than her, and had never once considered that this should bother her. Lieutenant Scylla Men appeared at Kale's side, her long Vithani limbs folding neatly as she leaned toward him. "That is the human," she said in her clicking analytical voice. "I can see that," Kale replied. "I have read 17 papers on their species, and I still cannot determine if they are genuinely brave or simply too stupid to understand danger." Kale grunted and said nothing, because he was wondering the same thing. He assigned the cohorts that afternoon, and he put Lena Vasquez into Cohort 9 on purpose. Cohort 9 was called the Pit by everyone who had ever survived it, and it was where Kale put the cadets he wanted to test the hardest. The centerpiece of Cohort 9 was a Krethok named Torvon, and Torvon was the kind of cadet who made other cadets reconsider their career choices. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders wide enough to block a Korogor, and teeth that could punch through light armor plating, and eyes the color of burning coal that never blinked when they locked onto something he considered beneath him, which was everything. Torvon had been the top-ranked cadet in his intake class on his homeworld, a planet where the qualification exam involved surviving alone in a forest full of creatures that hunted Krethok for sport. And he had not just survived, but had come back carrying one of their skulls as a trophy. He was going to eat the human alive, Kale thought. And then he corrected himself. He was going to try. The first day in the barracks, Torvon did what Krethok always did when they wanted to establish dominance over someone new. He growled. It was not a casual sound, not some theatrical rumble for show, but a deep subsonic vibration that started in his chest and rolled outward like a wave of pressure that every species in the galaxy had learned to associate with imminent and terrible violence. The other cadets in the corridor, a Palaki, 2 Vethani, and a smaller Krethok, all pressed themselves against the walls and averted their eyes, because that was the correct response when a Krethok, who outweighed you by 300 pounds, told you with every fiber of his being that you were not welcome here. Lena Vasquez was unpacking her duffel bag on her bunk. She looked up at Torvon the way someone might look up at a cloud passing overhead, with mild and passing interest, and then she went back to unpacking. Torvon blinked. Over the next 3 days he escalated, because Krethok did not handle being ignored well, and Torvon handled it worse than most. He shoulder-charged her in the corridor, hard enough to send a Palaki spinning into a wall, but Lena just stepped with the impact and kept walking. Bared his fangs at her during meals, a display that made the Vethani cadets physically leave the table. But Lena just chewed her food and nodded at him like he had said something polite about the weather. He slammed his fist into the wall next to her head during a briefing, cracking the composite panel, and she glanced at the crack and said, "You should put in a maintenance request for that." Kale watched all of this on the security feeds and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt uncertain. On the 4th night, after lights out, Torvon cornered her in the corridor outside the barracks. He pressed close enough that his breath moved her hair, and let out a territorial growl so deep and so full of menace that the vibration sensors in the floor registered it as a minor seismic event. The hallway camera captured everything in perfect clarity. It captured Torvon towering over her like a mountain of muscle and rage. Captured every other living thing in sensor range, freezing in place. And it captured Lena Vasquez, looking up at him with an expression that Tail would replay dozens of times in the coming weeks, trying to understand. She was not afraid. She was not angry. She was not performing courage the way some cadets did, forcing their bodies to stand still while their eyes screamed. She was genuinely, completely, unmistakably calm. She reached up and patted his shoulder the way someone might pat a large and excitable dog, and she said, "Good night, big guy," and then she walked past him and disappeared into the barracks. Torvon stood in that corridor for a long time after she left. The camera caught his expression too, and Kale had never seen anything like it on a Krethok face in 15 years of training them. It was confusion. Pure and total confusion. Because Torvon had spent his entire life in a galaxy that operated on a simple rule. Strong dominated and the weak submitted, and Lena Vasquez had just refused to do either. Kale closed the security feed and stared at the dark screen of his console for a while. Then he opened Lena's file again and read one line that he had skimmed past before. It said, "Humans are not the strongest species on their own world and never have been, yet they conquered it entirely, because they do not measure threat the way other species do, and they do not respond to dominance the way other species do. And every predator that ever tried to teach them their place is now extinct." Kale closed the file and sat in the dark and thought about what he had invited into his academy. Training in the pit began on a Monday, and by Wednesday, 2 cadets had already requested transfers. Kale had designed the first week to be brutal on purpose, because he believed that the fastest way to learn what someone was made of was to hit them so hard that everything fake fell away, and only the real thing was left standing. The first exercise was a zero-gravity combat drill in the station's centrifuge chamber. where the artificial gravity could be dialed from full to nothing in the span of a heartbeat. Torvon was magnificent in it, because of course he was, launching himself off walls with the kind of raw, explosive power that made observers flinch, catching other cadets mid-flight and pinning them against surfaces with one hand while barely breathing hard. Kirik the Vithani was precise and clinical, using her infrared vision to track heat signatures through the dark portions of the chamber, and striking from angles no one expected. Dros the Palecki was surprisingly agile in zero-G, his amphibian body twisting with a flexibility that land-born species simply could not match. And Lena Vasquez got thrown into a wall 14 times and finished dead last. Kale marked her score on his pad and expected to see frustration or shame, or the quiet resignation that usually preceded a transfer request. Instead, she floated to the edge of the chamber with a bruise already darkening on her cheekbone and said to Torvon, "Do that shoulder throw again. I want to see how you set your feet." Torvon stared at her like she had grown a second head, but something in his expression shifted just slightly, and he showed her the throw. She practiced it for an hour after everyone else had left. The second exercise was an endurance run through a simulated volcanic hellscape, a 5-kilometer course through chambers filled with heat generators and ash particle sprayers and floors that shifted and crumbled under heavy footsteps. The temperature inside peaked at 63 degrees, and the air was thick with grit that clogged filters and burned lungs. Torvon burst off the starting line like a missile, all raw power and thundering strides that ate up the ground beneath him. And for the first 2 kilometers, he was so far ahead that the tracking sensors almost lost the cadets behind him. Then the heat hit. Krethok were Death World predators, built for explosive force, for the sprint and the kill, for short bursts of terrifying violence that ended fights before they began. They were not built to sustain. At the 3-kilometer mark, Torvon's pace dropped by half, and his breathing turned ragged, and a deep biological warning system that had kept his species alive for millennia started screaming at him to stop and rest and conserve energy. He pushed through it, because he was Torvon, and his pride would carry him further than his legs ever could. But he crossed the finish line, gasping, his fur matted with sweat and ash, and collapsed onto his hands and knees. He finished first. Lena Vasquez finished third. Not through speed, not through power, not through any single physical gift that the Academy's sensors could measure and quantify. She finished third because she never changed her pace. From the starting line to the finish, she ran at the same steady rhythm, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth, her feet striking the ground with a monotonous mechanical consistency that the Vethani analysts found almost disturbing in its relentlessness. Cadets who were faster than her sprinted ahead and then fell behind as the heat drained them and their muscles screamed and their bodies shut down one system at a time. Lena just kept going. She was drenched in sweat, and her lips were cracked, and there was blood on her knees where she had stumbled twice on the shifting ground. But she never stopped, and she never slowed, and when she crossed the finish line, she was grinning through the pain like she was having the time of her life. Kale watched the replay 3 times, and then pulled up the human species file on his console and read it properly for the first time. What he found made the scales on the back of his neck rise. The file said that humans had evolved as persistence predators on their death world, that their ancient ancestors had not been the fastest or the strongest or the most dangerous creatures on their planet, but had instead developed a hunting strategy so simple and so terrifying that no other known species in the galaxy had ever replicated it. They chased their prey, not in a sprint, but in a long, slow, relentless pursuit that could last hours or even days, following their target across plains and through forests and over mountains, never fast enough to catch it in a burst, but never stopping, never resting, never giving up, until the prey, faster, stronger, more dangerous, finally succumbed, exhausted, and defeated. Stronger, better armed by nature, simply collapsed from exhaustion, and the human walked up to it and ended the chase. The file called it persistence predation, and it noted that humans were among the greatest endurance runners ever documented in any known biosphere, and that their cooling system, something called sweating, that most galactic species found deeply unsettling, allowed them to sustain physical effort in conditions that would shut down almost any other species. Kale shared the file with Scylla that evening in the instructor's quarters. She read it with her compound eyes flickering in the way that meant she was processing multiple data streams simultaneously, and when she finished, she was quiet for a long time. "There is a line here," she said finally, "that I think you should pay attention to." She read it aloud in her precise clicking voice. "Humans do not need to be the strongest. They simply need to not die long enough to learn how to." Kale thought about Lena asking Torvon to show her the shoulder throw, and felt a cold understanding settle into his chest. In the tactical simulations that followed, his understanding only deepened. The simulations were war games, complex scenarios where cadets had to read terrain, predict enemy movement, coordinate with teammates, and make split-second decisions under pressure. Torvon approached them like he approached everything, with overwhelming force and the absolute certainty that the biggest and strongest thing on the field would naturally dominate. And he was right, mostly, because when you weighed 400 pounds and could break a combat drone in half with your bare hands, tactical subtlety was often unnecessary. But Lena was doing something different. Lena was watching. In the first simulation she lost in 4 minutes because Torvon flanked her position and she never saw him coming. In the second simulation, she lost in 6 minutes, but this time she saw the flank coming and tried to counter it and failed. In the third simulation, she lasted 11 minutes and almost caught Torvon in a crossfire that he escaped only because his raw speed carried him out of the kill zone before it closed. By the fifth simulation, Kale realized what was happening, and it sent a chill down his spine. She was learning Torvon's patterns, not studying them in the abstract, the way a Vithani would, breaking them down into data points and probability matrices, but absorbing them intuitively, the way a predator learns the habits of its prey, through repetition and failure, the slow, patient accumulation of understanding that comes from being willing to lose 100 times in order to win once. She started reading Chirrut too, predicting the Vithani's flanking angles before Chirrut even committed to them. She figured out that Dross always hesitated before crossing open ground, and she used that hesitation to set traps. She still lost most of her sparring matches, because the raw physical gap between her and the other cadets was enormous, and no amount of pattern recognition could fully close it. But she lost less each time, and she was always the one who asked to go again. The midterm ranked assessment was posted on the wall of the common room on a cold artificial morning, while the station's climate systems cycled through their night-to-day transition. Lena Vasquez had entered the academy, ranked 30th out of 30 cadets in Cohort 9. She was now ranked 11th. She had climbed 19 positions in 7 weeks, through nothing but stubbornness and sweat, and the relentless, terrifying human refusal to accept that where you start is where you have to stay. Kale watched the cadets gather around the board, and he watched Torvon, who was still ranked first, because of course he was, and he saw the big Krethok find Lena's name on the list, and he saw the expression on Torvon's face change. The growling had stopped weeks ago. The shoulder charges had stopped. The dominance displays had stopped. Torvon looked at Lena's name, and then he looked at Lena, who was leaning against the far wall, drinking water with that easy smile on her face. And what Kale saw in the Krethok's burning coal eyes was not contempt, and not confusion, It was wariness. The most dangerous predator in the pit had looked at the smallest, weakest creature in his cohort, and had realized for the first time that he could not predict what she would become. And for a Krethok who had built his entire identity on being the thing that everything else was afraid of, that was the most unsettling realization in the world. Kale closed his evaluation file and added one note at the bottom. Recommend continued observation. Cadet Vasquez is not improving. She is adapting, and I am no longer certain where the ceiling is. N.P. The ice moon Veltra 4 was the kind of place that made even Death World species reconsider their definition of hostile. Its surface was a rolling expanse of white and gray, split by crevasses that dropped hundreds of meters into darkness, swept by winds that carried ice crystals sharp enough to score metal plating, and buried under a sky so thick with cloud cover that the difference between day and night was the difference between dark gray and slightly darker gray. The Academy used it for the 72-hour survival field exercise because it was real. Not a simulation, not a holographic projection, not a controlled environment where safety systems could pull you out if your heart rate dropped too low. Real cold, real wind, real danger, and every year at least one cadet had to be emergency evacuated with injuries that left permanent marks. Kale briefed the cohorts in the shuttle bay, with his voice pitched loud enough to cut through the engine noise and the nervous. You will be dropped in scattered pods across the northern ice shelf, he told them. You will navigate to the extraction point at grid reference 774, using only the equipment in your survival kits. You will be hunted by automated combat drones that will not kill you, but will hurt you enough to make you wish they had. And you will do all of this in teams, because the one thing that Veltra 4 punishes more than weakness is being alone. Lena stood near the back of the group between Torvon and Dross, and she was doing the thing that Kale had learned to watch for. She was studying the briefing map with that quiet, focused expression that meant she was not just memorizing the route, but building a mental model of every possible thing that could go wrong along the way. The drop was rough. The pod scattered across 10 square kilometers of ice shelf, and the moment Lena's pod cracked open, she was hit by a wall of cold, so total and so absolute, felt less like temperature and more like a physical force trying to push her back inside. She had trained for cold environments, but training and reality were different animals entirely, and reality was currently trying to freeze the moisture in her eyes shut. She found Torvon and Dross within the first hour, because they had landed closest, and because Torvon's massive frame left tracks in the snow that a blind creature could follow. Dross was already struggling. The Peleki were a warm-water amphibian species, evolved in tropical oceans on a world where the coldest temperature ever recorded would be considered a pleasant spring day on Earth. And Veltra 4 was attacking every biological system he had. His skin, which needed moisture to function, was cracking in the dry, frozen air. His movements were growing sluggish as his cold-blooded metabolism began to slow. And his eyes had taken on a glassy, faraway look that Lena recognized from her survival training as the early stage of severe hypothermia. He needs to move, Torvin said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, but there was the hard, pragmatic edge of someone raised in a culture where survival was not a group activity. If he stops, he dies, and if he dies while we are carrying him, then we die too. He is not going to die, Lena said. You cannot know that. I can decide it. They pushed on through the ice fields for another 3 hours, with Lena on one side of Dross and Torvin on the other, and the wind howling around them like something alive and furious, and personally offended by their continued existence. Then the blizzard hit. It came from the north like a white wall, a curtain of ice and wind so dense that visibility dropped to less than 2 meters in the span of 30 seconds, and the temperature, which had already been brutal, plunged another 15 degrees into a range that even Torvin's thick fur could not fully insulate against. Could not move in this, and they could not see the extraction point. and the combat drones were still out there somewhere in the white hell, circling like patient mechanical vultures. Torvald turned to Lena, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain. "We shelter," Lena said, and she said it with such immediate authority that Torvald obeyed before he had time to realize that he was taking orders from a creature half his size. She found a snowbank on the lee side of a ridge, and she started digging. Torvald watched her for 3 seconds, and then he started digging too, because whatever else he thought about humans, he had learned that when Lena Vasquez started doing something, with that particular look on her face, the smart move was to help. They carved out a snow shelter in 20 minutes, a compact dome-shaped space just large enough for the 3 of them, and Lena packed the walls tight and smooth with her gloved hands, using techniques had been passed down on Earth for thousands of years by people who had lived in places just as cold and just as merciless as this. Inside the shelter, the wind dropped from a scream to a murmur, and the temperature rose just enough to pull them back from the edge. But Dross was getting worse. His body temperature was dropping faster than the shelter could compensate for, and his breathing had gone shallow and slow, and his skin had turned a pale gray color that Lena had never seen on a Palecki before, and hoped she would never see again. She pulled off her thermal outer layer and wrapped it around him. "What are you doing?" Torvald said, and it was not really a question, but a statement of disbelief. "He needs it more than I do." "You will freeze." "Humans are warm-blooded. We generate our own heat. I will be uncomfortable, but I will survive." "You do not know that either." Lena looked at him with her jaw set and her brown eyes steady. She said, "He is our pack, Torvald. We do not leave pack behind." The word hit Torvald like a physical blow, because pack was a concept that existed in Krethok culture, but it was reserved for blood relations, for the tight inner circle of family that a Krethok would kill and die for without hesitation, and it was never ever extended to strangers. And yet this human, who had known Dross for less than 2 months, and who shared not a single drop of common biology with him, was shivering in a snow cave on an ice moon, with her thermal layer wrapped around his failing body. And she was calling him Pack like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Torvald could have pushed past her and left. He could have gone on alone, because he was strong enough and tough enough, and the extraction point was probably reachable, even in the blizzard, if he pushed hard. He stayed. He did not fully understand why he stayed, but he stayed. The night was long, and it was brutal. Filled it with her voice, because silence in the cold was a killer, and she knew it. She talked about Earth, about the oceans, and the mountains, and the forests, and the deserts, about a planet so wildly varied in its environments that humans had learned to survive in all of them, from frozen tundra to scorching sand to the bottom of the sea. She talked about her family, about her mother, who had been a marine biologist, and her father, who had been a firefighter, and how both of them in their own way had spent their lives running toward the things that everyone else ran away from. She told a story about a human explorer from centuries ago who had been strapped on a ship frozen in the ice of a polar sea for over a year, and had kept his crew alive through the darkness and the cold by making them sing and play games and put on theatrical performances, because humans had learned long ago that the body could survive almost anything, as long as the mind did not surrender. Laughed at one point, a short, sharp barking sound that surprised him more than it surprised Lena, and she grinned at him in the dim blue light of their emergency lantern, and for a moment the cold did not matter. She rubbed Dross's limbs through the night to keep his circulation going, steady, rhythmic motions that she maintained for hours, even as her own body shook with cold, and her fingers went numb, and her lips turned blue. Kale watched the shelter's internal camera feed from the command center back on the station, and he watched Lena Vasquez shiver for 6 hours straight to keep a near stranger alive. and he had to set down his datapad because his hands were not steady. Scylla stood beside him and watched the same feed with her analytical Vithani calm. And when dawn broke on Veltra 4 and the blizzard finally died, she said, "She used social bonding as a survival mechanism. It is remarkable from a behavioral science perspective." Kale said nothing for a long time. Then he opened his evaluation file and wrote one word: dangerous. The blizzard broke with the dawn, and the three of them crawled out of the snow shelter into a world that was still frozen and hostile, but at least visible. Dross was alive. His temperature had stabilized during the night, thanks to the thermal layer, and Lena's relentless stubborn refusal to let his body shut down. And when he opened his eyes and saw her crouching over him with frost in her hair and exhaustion carved into every line of her face, he made a sound in the Peleki language that the translator rendered as something between "thank you" and "I owe you a debt that has no name." They reached the extraction point 4 hours later, the last team to arrive, stumbling across the finish line like survivors of a shipwreck. Lena was hypothermic, dehydrated, and running on nothing but willpower and whatever strange fuel burned inside humans when every rational system in their body told them to stop. Torvan carried Dross the last kilometer on his back, without being asked. When the medical team took Dross away on a stretcher, Torvan stood outside the med bay and waited. He waited for an hour, without moving, a mountain of dark fur and muscle standing perfectly still in the corridor like a sentinel carved from stone. When Lena walked out, pale and wrapped in a silver thermal blanket with an IV port still taped to her arm, Torvan dipped his head. It was a small motion, barely noticeable to anyone who did not know what it meant. But Kale knew. It was the Krethok gesture of acknowledging an equal, not a superior, not an inferior, but someone who had earned the right to stand beside you and be counted as the same. Lena smiled that easy, warm smile and bumped her fist against his massive forearm and said, "Told you he would make it." Behind her, Dross sat up on his stretcher wrapped in heating blankets, with color returning to his skin, and he let out a croaking Peleki laugh that echoed down the corridor. And Kale, standing in the shadows at the far end of the hall, watching all of this unfold, realized that something had changed in Cohort 9 that could not be unchanged. The human had not just survived the ice, she had turned 3 strangers into a pack. The Crucible was the Academy's oldest tradition and its cruelest one. It had been running for over 200 years, a gladiatorial gauntlet designed not to test what cadets had learned, but to strip away everything they had learned and see what was left underneath. The raw, unpolished core of whoever they actually were, when skill and training and preparation all failed, and the only thing between them and defeat was whatever they carried in the deepest part of themselves. The arena was a massive circular pit carved into the lower levels of Station Korath 7, ringed by tiers of observation platforms where senior officers and foreign dignitaries and military attachés from a dozen species sat and watched and judged with the cold, detached interest of people who had seen 1,000 cadets break and were waiting to see which ones would break today. Kale stood at the command console on the primary observation deck, with Scylla beside him, and watched Cohort 9 file into the staging area below. Torvan entered first, rolling his massive shoulders, his coal-red eyes sweeping the arena with the predatory focus of someone who had been built for exactly this kind of moment. Chirik came next, her wings folded tight against her back, her compound eyes already mapping the terrain and calculating angles. Dross moved with a new steadiness that had not been there before Veltra 4, something solid and sure in his posture that said he had been through the worst thing he could imagine and had come out the other side. And Lena walked in last, with her hands loose at her sides, and that smile on her face, that easy, unbothered smile that Kale had spent weeks trying to decode, and had finally concluded was not a performance at all, but simply the natural expression of a creature that had made peace with the universe's ability to hurt her, and had decided to enjoy the ride anyway. The combat rounds began, and they were exactly as savage as the Crucible always was. Cadets fought cadets in the center of the pit, one-on-one, no weapons, no rules beyond the prohibition on killing, and the sound of it echoed up through the arena like distant thunder, the crack of impact, the grunt of exertion, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. Torvon was devastating. He moved through his bracket like a natural disaster, each fight ending in seconds. His opponents launched across the pit, or pinned to the ground, or simply overwhelmed by the sheer terrifying force of a Krethok at full fury. Shirak was surgical, exploiting weak points with a precision that made the Vithani dignitaries in the stands click their mandibles in approval. And Lena fought smart. She could not match the raw power of most of her opponents, and she did not try. Instead, she used the arena itself as a weapon, leading stronger cadets into corners where their size worked against them, baiting charges and sidestepping at the last instant. Their momentum into their downfall. She took hits that would have put most species on the ground, and she got back up every single time, not quickly, not gracefully, but with a dogged, relentless refusal to stay down that made the audience go quiet in a way that pure dominance never could. She won some fights, and she lost some fights, but she fought every single one of them like it mattered, and by the end of the combat rounds, there was blood on her lip and a bruise darkening around her left eye, and she was breathing hard and grinning like a woman who had just been given exactly what she wanted. The dignitaries were leaning forward in their seats. Then came the final challenge. Kale activated the arena's central containment field, and the floor opened, and something rose up from the holding pens below that made half the cadets in the staging area take an involuntary step backward. The Varketh. It was 7 feet of compact predatory muscle covered in overlapping razor-edged plates that shifted and clicked as it moved, with 4 limbs ending in hooked claws, and a head that was mostly jaw. A wide, flat wedge of bone and teeth, designed by evolution for one purpose and one purpose only. It was muzzled, but unrestrained, and it moved across the arena floor with the fluid, terrible grace of something that had never in its entire existence encountered a creature it could not kill. The Varketh was selected specifically for this test because of one unique biological trait. It hunted by detecting fear pheromones. Its entire predatory strategy was built around the chemical signature of terror, the cocktail of stress hormones and panic signals that prey species released when they knew they were going to die. And the Varketh could smell it from 100 meters away, and it drove the creature into a killing frenzy as reliable as a switch being flipped. The test was simple in concept and devastating in execution. Each cadet would enter the arena alone, and the Varketh would charge them. And if the cadet held their ground, the beast would be recalled by the containment system before contact. If the cadet broke and ran, they failed. That was all. One by one the cadets stepped into the ring, and one by one the Varketh tested them. Some held, jaw clenched, legs locked, every muscle in their bodies screaming to run, while their will held them in place through sheer force of determination. Many broke, and there was no shame in it, because the Varketh's threat display was a masterpiece of evolutionary terror, a guttural, bone-rattling roar that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the ancient screaming animal brain that every species carried buried beneath their civilization. Even Torvon, who held his ground with his fists raised and his fangs bared and a counter-roar building in his chest, had a heart rate that spiked into the red on Kale's monitoring console. It was Lena's turn. She stepped into the arena, and the Varketh turned toward her immediately. The arena went quiet. Up on the observation deck, Kale's claws dug into the edge of his console, and Scylla's hand hovered over the emergency recall switch, and across the tiers of seats, 100 pairs of alien eyes focused on the smallest creature to enter the ring all day. The Varketh approached. It moved with that liquid predatory walk, its plated body shifting and clicking, its head low and its jaws working behind the muzzle as it tasted the air for the chemical signature it craved. It stopped. Something was wrong, and every observer in the arena could see it in the way the creature's body language shifted from hunting confidence to confusion. It sniffed again, deeper, pulling the air across the specialized receptor organs in its nasal cavity, searching for the pheromone signature that should have been flooding the arena because there was a small, soft, defenseless creature standing 10 meters away, and every law of nature said that creature should be drowning in fear. But the pheromone was not there. Lena's heart rate was elevated. The monitors showed that clearly. Adrenaline was surging through her system at levels that would have been classified as a combat response in any medical textbook. But the chemical signature of that response was not fear. It was excitement. Her body was not preparing to flee. It was preparing to engage. The Varketh charged. It covered the distance in 2 explosive strides, a blur of plated muscle and hooked claws, and it reared up to its full height, 3 feet from Lena's face, and opened its muzzled jaws, and released a roar that shook the arena walls, and rattled the observation platforms, and sent vibrations through the floor that every person in the building felt in their bones. Every instructor froze. Scylla's finger touched the recall switch, breathing, and Lena Vasquez grinned. Not a grimace, not a brave face, not the desperate rictus of someone holding themselves together through willpower alone. A real grin, wide and bright, with her teeth showing and her eyes alive with something that looked for all the world like delight. She leaned forward, toward the monster, and she said, clear as starlight, loud enough for every microphone in the arena to capture with perfect clarity, "Nice try." The Varketh hesitated. In its entire existence, across every hunt and every confrontation and every threat display it had ever performed, it had never encountered this response. Every creature it had ever faced had produced one of 2 chemical signatures, the sharp acid scent of terror that meant prey, or the hot metallic scent of aggression that meant rival. This creature produced neither. This creature smelled like something the Varketh had no category for, registered not as prey, and not as predator, and not as threat, but as something entirely outside the framework that millions of years of evolution had built into its brain. The Varketh lowered its head. It took 1 step back, and then another, and then it turned away from Lena Vasquez and walked to the far side of the arena, and sat down, and did not look at her again. The silence in the arena lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Torvald's voice shattered it, a full-throated Krethok battle cheer that erupted from the staging area like a cannon shot, a roar not of aggression, but of triumph and joy, and something that sounded almost like pride. Dross joined him, his Pilecki voice cracking with emotion. Shirik's wings buzzed in the Vithani applause. Cohort 9 erupted into noise, and the noise spread upward through the tiers, as species after species added their own sounds of astonishment and recognition. On the observation deck, Kale stared at his console, where Lena's biometric data still scrolled across the screen in clean green lines. Heart rate elevated, adrenaline high, cortisol low, fear markers absent, and he typed 1 line into his evaluation. She did not dominate it, and she did not submit. She simply refused to be prey, and I have never seen anything like it. A senior Draelkin admiral, who had been watching from the command tier, stepped up beside Kale, and looked down at the arena, where Lena was high-fiving Torvald, with blood still on her lip, and that grin still on her face, and the admiral said in a quiet voice that carried the weight of someone who had commanded fleets and won wars, What are humans? Kale watched the woman below, this small, soft, clawless, fangless creature, who had just stared down a nightmare and laughed in its face. And he thought about ice moons and persistence, and a species that had conquered its own death world not by being the strongest thing on it, but by being the one thing on it that simply refused to stop. They are what happens, Kale said, when a death world breeds something that hunts everything, including fear itself. The Admiral was quiet for a long time after that. Below in the arena, Lena Vasquez sat on the ground, with her back against the wall, and Torvon beside her, and Dross in her lap, and Chirik perched on a railing above them, and she looked up at the lights of the arena, and she was still smiling. Because she had always known something that the rest of the galaxy was only just beginning to understand. Fear was not a wall. It was a door. And humans had been walking through it since the very first night one of their ancestors looked into the darkness beyond the firelight and decided to see what was out there. Graduation day on Station Korath 7 began with silence. It was tradition, a full minute of quiet before the ceremony started, meant to honor every cadet who had entered the Academy's doors and not made it to this moment. The ones who had washed out, the ones who had broken, the ones who had been carried to medical bays and shipped home with injuries that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Kale stood at the podium on the stage of the Grand Assembly Hall and looked out over the rows of cadets in their formal dress uniforms and felt the silence settle over them like a living thing. He had done this 12 times before, and it had always felt the same, proud, solemn, heavy with the weight of knowing that he was sending young soldiers into a galaxy that would test them in ways the Academy could only simulate. This year, it felt different. This year, his eyes kept drifting to the fourth row, where Cohort 9 sat together in a tight cluster that would have been unremarkable, except for the fact that 6 months ago, the idea of these particular individuals sitting within arm's reach of each other without violence would have been absurd. Torvon sat at the center because he was still Torvon, and he still took up more space than any two cadets combined, but the way he sat had changed in a way that only someone who had watched him as closely as Kale had would notice. His shoulders were angled slightly inward, oriented not outward in the universal predator posture of territorial dominance, but toward the people beside him, a subtle, unconscious shift in body language that said, "These are mine, and I am theirs." Dross sat to his left, with his Peleki skin healthy and gleaming under the hall's warm lights, a far cry from the gray-faced dying creature who had nearly frozen to death on an ice moon, and his webbed hands were folded in his lap with a steadiness that Kale knew had been earned in the hardest possible way. Perched on Torvon's right, her Vathani wings folded neatly, her compound eyes still and focused in a way that meant she was not analyzing or calculating or processing data, but simply being present, which was something Vathani almost never did, because their minds were always running, and the fact that she had learned to be still was itself a small miracle. And Lena sat at the end of the row with her dress uniform crisp, and her dark hair freshly cut, and that smile on her face. That quiet, easy, warm smile that had confused Torvon, and intrigued Kale, and baffled an apex predator, and somehow, over the course of 6 months, had become the thing that held 4 completely different species together, like gravity. She was ranked 4th in the final standings, 4th out of 30, the highest any human had ever placed in the history of the Academy. And she had done it without claws, or fangs, or venom, or armor, or any of the advantages that every other species in the top 10 carried. A birthright. She had done it by being the most stubborn, most adaptable, most relentlessly optimistic creature that Kale had ever had the privilege and the terror of training. The silence ended, and Kale began to speak. He talked about the Academy's history, because that was expected. about the generations of soldiers who had passed through these halls and gone on to serve the Galactic Union in every theater of conflict and cooperation that the galaxy had to offer. He talked about strength because that was the theme he had chosen, and because it was the thing he had spent the most time thinking about this year. For 200 years, he said, his deep Trailkin voice carrying across the hall with the resonance of a species that had evolved to be heard across vast distances. This academy has measured strength in the same way, in the weight a cadet can lift, in the force a cadet can strike with, in the speed a cadet can move, and the damage a cadet can absorb, and the threat a cadet can project. He paused and looked at the ranked board displayed on the wall behind him, where the names of the top 10 cadets glowed in gold. By those metrics, the rankings are clear, and the Krethok have held the top position for 60 consecutive years, and there is no species in this galaxy that would dispute their claim to the title of the most physically formidable soldiers ever trained within these walls. Torvon straightened slightly in his seat, because even a changed Krethok was still a Krethok, and praise was praise. But this year, Kale said, and his voice dropped to something quieter and more personal, a human taught me something. The hall went very still. She taught me that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not the creature that can kill you. He looked directly at Lena, and she looked back at him with those calm brown eyes. It is the creature that will not stop, that bleeds and gets back up, loses and learns, that faces a monster and laughs, not because it does not understand the danger, but because it has decided that the danger does not get to define who it is. Lena's smile did not change, but something in her eyes did, something soft and bright, that she blinked away quickly, because she was still Lena, and Lena did not do sentiment in public if she could help it. Kale straightened, and his voice returned to its formal cadence. It is my honor to announce that Cohort 9 has been selected for assignment to Frontier Task Force Aegis. A murmur ran through the hall, because Aegis was not a standard posting. Aegis was an elite rapid response unit assigned to the Vorath Expanse, a lawless frontier sector on the Outer Rim where 3 species were locked in a territorial dispute that had been escalating toward open war for the past 2 years, where diplomacy had failed, and military posturing had failed, and the Union needed something different. That could fight and talk and adapt and hold together under pressure that would shatter a conventional unit. Kale had recommended Cohort 9 for Aegis personally, and he had done it because of something Scylla had said to him the week before when he was reviewing the assignment options. You are not sending them because they are the strongest cohort, she had said in her precise clicking way. No, he had agreed, you are sending them because they are the most human. He had looked at her, and she had looked back with her compound eyes, and he had realized that she was right, and that the word human was no longer just a species designation in his mind, but had become something larger, a description of a way of being in the universe that he had never encountered before, and that he believed the galaxy needed desperately. The ceremony ended, and the cadets filed out into the broad corridor that led to the shuttle bays, and Kale watched Cohort 9 walk together in. The way that they had learned to walk together, not in formation but in the loose, easy arrangement of people who trusted each other with their lives. Torvon walked point because old habits died hard, and because nobody was going to argue with 400 pounds of Krethok taking the lead. Shirik walked the left flank, her compound eyes scanning constantly, her analytical mind already running scenarios for the Vorath Expanse. Dross covered the right, moving with a quiet confidence that would have been unrecognizable to the frightened, freezing cadet who had nearly died on an ice moon. And Lena walked in the center, not because she needed protection, but because that was where the heart of a pack belonged. She stopped at the shuttle bay door and turned to her team and looked at each of them in turn. The predator who had learned that strength was not the same thing as dominance. The analyst who had learned that data was not the same thing as understanding. Survivor who had learned that being saved was not the same thing as being weak. "So," she said, slinging her pack over her shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had been carrying heavy things her entire life and had never once complained about the weight. "Who is ready to make some friends?" Torvon cracked his knuckles, and the sound was like small-caliber gunfire. Dross flexed his webbed fingers and smiled a Palecki smile that showed entirely too many teeth. Shirik's wings buzzed once, a sharp, eager sound, and she said, "I have already identified 17 potential diplomatic leverage points in the Vorath territorial dispute." And Lena laughed and said, "That is great, Shirik, but maybe we start with hello." They boarded the shuttle, and the doors closed, and the engine spooled up with a rising whine that Kale felt in his bones. He stood at the observation window and watched the shuttle lift off the deck and rotate toward the bay doors, and he did not look away until it was through the atmospheric barrier and gone, a small bright point of light moving against the vast dark canvas of space. Scylla appeared beside him the way she always did, silent and precise. "Do you think they are ready?" she asked. Kale thought about a woman in a snow cave shivering through the night to keep a stranger alive. He thought about a Krethok who had learned to dip his head. He thought about a predator backing away from something it could not classify as prey. He thought about a species that had crawled out of the mud on a violent little world and looked up at the stars and said, "Those are ours too," and had meant it with every fiber of their strange, stubborn, beautiful being. "The galaxy is not ready for them," he said. Scylla considered this for a moment, with the careful, analytical precision of her species, and then she made a sound that Kale had never heard of Athani make before. She laughed. In the dark, between the stars, a shuttle carrying a Krethok and a Vithani and a Palecki and a human burned toward the frontier, toward danger and diplomacy and the unknown. And inside it Lena Vasquez sat with her feet up on her pack and her arms behind her head and her eyes closed and that smile on her face. Because the galaxy was vast and old and full of things that were bigger and stronger and faster and more dangerous than she would ever be. And she could not wait to meet every single one of them.